When a 44-year-old nurse by the name of Cindy James would start getting terrifying phone calls, she would begin calling the police. But these incidents would turn into more than phone calls. She would start getting harassing letters and death threats, as well as being attacked several times. But the police didn't really believe her. They thought that she had been making it up and she had really just been doing this stuff to herself. Over the course of 7 years, Cindy would report 100 separate incidents of harassment to the police department. And eventually, Cindy would go missing. Soon after, her body would be found, and the police would rule it an elaborate suicide. But many still believe that Cindy was murdered. Hi everybody, and welcome back to Killer Concepts, the place where we talk about all things true crime. My name's Peyton. If you are new here, make sure to hit that red subscribe button down below and turn on your post notifications so that you do not miss a thing. We talk about all things true crime here, including true crime cases, as well as funny crimes that I have been doing lately. So as I said in my last funny crimes video, I am giving you 2 videos this week because I missed my true crime video last week. And we are talking about a woman named Cindy James. This is quite possibly one of the strangest cases that I have ever heard. I heard it quite a while ago. I knew eventually I'd want to cover it, and then I just felt like this was the right time. You guys really seem to like my case on Richard Farley and the stalking of Laura Black, and so I wanted to talk about an even stranger stalking case. So Cindy James was a woman from Vancouver, British Columbia. She was the oldest of 6 children, and she was super intelligent. She was also a very beautiful young girl, and she always did well in school. She was just a really well-behaved girl. Her family was pretty close. Her mother was always very kind, and there have been mixed reports about her father and her home life in general. Some stories that I've heard said that her father could be a little rough and maybe even abusive, but she would become closer with him later in her life. So I want to take those accounts with a grain of salt because I did not see it across the board in my research, and so I do not want to come out and say that her father was an abuser when I am not 100% sure of that. So as I said, Cindy was a very beautiful and ambitious girl, and that is why it did not surprise anybody in her family when she decided that she was going to go off to college and she was going to become a nurse. Everybody had thought that she was the perfect person to be a caretaker, and she was smart enough to be able to do it well. And so she would go off to college to become a nurse. So Cindy would graduate nursing school in 1966, and she would become a pediatric nurse. Cindy loved working with children, and so this was the perfect job for her. But she was a very intelligent young lady, and for somebody her age, she had moved up in the world very quickly. And that's why a few years later, after becoming a nurse, she would actually become an administrator at a preschool that was for children with behavioral and mental disabilities. This is a job that she loved. She really liked working with the children, and she was very good at it. When Cindy James was 19, she would eventually meet a man by the name of Dr. Roy Makepeace. He was a doctor, and he was actually 18 years her senior, but it didn't really seem to bother Cindy, and Makepeace didn't have a problem with it either, and so the two would actually marry. The two would actually be pretty happily married for several years, but Cindy eventually would decide that she wanted to file for divorce from Dr. Roy Makepeace, and then in 1982, she would finally file and the two would separate. I do just want to mention that the two never had children together, although Roy Makepeace did have children from his previous marriage. So Cindy never had any children of her own. So I already told you that this is a case of stalking, and so 6 months after Cindy and Makepeace would divorce, Cindy would start receiving very strange phone calls. She would answer her phone, and sometimes she'd hear just breathing on the other end. Sometimes somebody would threaten her. They would just say very vile and sexual things towards her. And this, like I said, began 6 months after her and her husband had divorced, which was very strange. At first, Cindy would keep these phone calls to herself. She really didn't want anybody to know, and she wasn't going to call the police. But eventually, she'd talk to her mother and father, and they would tell her that she really should report the phone calls. It could become dangerous, and so that's what Cindy would do. So on October 12th, 1982, this is when Cindy would report the first batch of phone calls. You know, police really didn't do anything. They basically said that unless they see somebody or have proof of who it was, or if she knew who it was, they really couldn't do much about it. And so Cindy just went home and she left it at that. And then again on October 13th, 1982, Cindy got some more phone calls and some more harassment. But on this day, she would also tell the police that she thought she had seen somebody hanging around the back door of her rental home. But once again, Cindy could not prove it, and so the police kind of just brushed it off because there was really nothing that they could do at that point in time. But then again, on October 15th, 1982, only 2 days later, Cindy would make another report to the police, and this would become a very common occurrence. Like I said, over the course of 7 years, Cindy had made 100 reports to the police of harassment, but this day it was a little bit different. It wasn't just a phone call. Cindy had actually had a rock thrown through the window of her home, and so she was terrified and she would call the police. Not long after, things that were even more horrific than the phone calls and somebody just hanging out around Cindy's house would start happening. Cindy had gotten home one day and there were actually 3 cats that were hanging outside of her home. I believe it was in her garden from what I read. And I could not imagine the fear that went through this woman, as well as the fact that there were dead animals, that somebody had the hatred in them to be able to kill the animals in order to scare Cindy. And so she would report this to the police, but once again, there wasn't really anything they could do about it, but they started maybe taking her a little bit more seriously at this point because stuff was starting to escalate. So like I said, at this point, things were escalating and things started getting worse, and notes would start appearing on Cindy's doorstep or in her mailbox. And at one point, something would even appear on her car. And these notes were very graphic, violent. They were very threatening. Some of them included photos of Cindy herself. But a lot of the notes that were given to her had pictures of like somebody with hands around their throats, knives. Some of them had the words like die, death, and women just in really compromising positions. They were absolutely terrifying. And then the letters were kind of cut out like you'd see in a horror movie where they cut the letters out of magazines or something and they glued them onto the paper to say the message. And that's like what Cindy was getting. And it was absolutely terrifying to her. And she would keep all of these letters. So after Cindy and her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, did get divorced, they would still hang out sometimes or do things together. Part of the reason was that Dr. Makepeace was worried about what was happening to Cindy, and so one day they went back to Cindy's home and she found that one of her pillows had been slashed. It had been stabbed, and she didn't want to call the police, which was a bit strange. She actually told Dr. Makepeace to throw the pillow away, and he would be the one who would eventually convince her that she needed to call the authorities, that this was not good, somebody needed to see it. And eventually she would. Like I said, they had thrown away the pillow though, because that is what she wanted. And police officers would show up. And this is when Cindy would meet Officer Pat McBride. He was a detective, and he would actually start working on Cindy's case quite often when she had an incident happen. When Cindy first met Officer Pat McBride, he had assumed that possibly Dr. Roy Makepeace was the one who slashed her pillow and maybe was even doing this to her. But Cindy James would not really allow that theory to continue. She did not believe that's who was doing it to her. She didn't believe that he would do something like that to her. And so she basically shut that down from the beginning. Now, Officer McBride didn't fully get rid of that theory because it was always something very strange. It was only 6 months after the two had divorced that these things started happening, and Roy Makepeace was always hanging around. But like I said, Cindy brushed it off and she said it was not him. So like I said, Officer Pat McBride was the one who would often respond to Cindy's phone calls. He would end up putting deadbolts on Cindy's doors to try and just help protect her a little bit more. We all know that it's much easier to get into a home that does not have the deadbolt closed on it. But since Officer Pat McBride was seeing Cindy so often, the two ended up growing a lot closer. And they would actually end up dating, which was a strange relationship for a police officer and a victim of harassment, but that is what would happen. So on October 30th, 1982, Cindy would then find a note on her porch with cutout magazine letters like I had explained, and only a day later, Officer Pat McBride would end up moving in with her. Now, he would only be there for about a month. Not long after McBride would move in, he experienced something very strange. So he was outside of Cindy's home when he would see Dr. Roy Makepeace out there with a knife and a gun. And Dr. Roy Makepeace would say that he was patrolling the area because he wanted to protect Cindy. But it was just a very strange scenario and they kind of moved on. But just keep that in mind as things are going on. Then, in mid-November, Cindy would find a picture of a corpse tucked under the windshield wipers of her vehicle. And this is when she would also find that her phone lines had been cut in 5 different places. Police would come out, they would inspect the scene, they would try and see what all was going on, but they would really find nothing. They found nothing that led to who could possibly be doing this. And so once again, they brushed it off and they thought maybe Cindy was doing it to herself. So then in the beginning of December of 1982, Cindy would ask Officer Pat McBride to move out of her home. She just wanted to live there by herself at this point. And I just want to mention that it's a little strange, and I don't think the police looked into Officer Pat McBride as much as they possibly should have, because he ended up, so at the whole time that he was there, nothing major really happened to Cindy. And to me, that's just very strange. I don't know, I may be overthinking it. Maybe it's because a police officer was there that nobody would want to commit a crime, but it's just something that I'd like to know more about. What did they really look into Officer Pat McBride, if at all, because he was a police officer? Because there are times where police officers are criminals and they do things and they get away with it because nobody thinks to ever look at them. One thing I don't want to forget to mention while I remember is that there had also been incidents where Cindy's lights for her front porch had actually been smashed 1 or 2 times, which is terrifying. I would just fall over and die if I had been her. I don't know how she went on with this so long. But due to all the threatening phone calls that Cindy was receiving, the phone company would actually tap the phone line so that Officer Pat McBride and other police officers could try and trace the calls and see where they were coming from. They only had luck one time where Cindy tried to keep them on the phone long enough, and this time they found out that the call was coming from somewhere outside of Vancouver, but they could not pinpoint it quite as well. I mean, I'm sure if they would have been in a time where we had cell phones and stuff, they would have easily been able to find out who was calling. But yeah, they knew it was around Vancouver, but that didn't really tell them much. I mean, they were living in Vancouver at the time. So the threats would only get worse and worse and more frightening, and Cindy would find another note. So on January 4th, 1983, Cindy would find more disturbing pictures in her mailbox, and then Pat McBride would actually find something on her lawn. This letter would include pictures of corpses, knives, and women with their faces scratched out, as well as words like mangled pulp and dead. This is where the police started taking her a little bit more seriously because Officer Pat McBride had been there and he had found it, but they still weren't sure if Cindy was doing this to herself or not. So for a little while after this, the phone calls would actually stop. This is something that would happen several times throughout the 7 years of harassment that Cindy James would report. And it would make her feel like it was done and they were finally moving on and they were leaving her alone. But then it would only be a little while later before the phone calls would start back up again, and so would the harassment. And it was at this point when the incident started getting violent for Cindy. So the first major incident would happen on January 27th, 1983, when Cindy's friend Agnes Woodcock would come to her house as they were supposed to be doing something that night and hanging out a little bit. Now, when Agnes had got to Cindy's house, nobody answered the door, which was a little bit unusual for Cindy, but Agnes was not that concerned because sometimes I guess Cindy liked to soak in the bathtub at night, and so she was assuming that's all it was. But when Cindy did not come to the door, she would end up walking around to Cindy's backyard, and this is where she'd find Cindy crouched down. So Cindy was crouching down like she was trying to hide from something, and when she noticed that it was Agnes, she would stand up, and it was like Cindy was having a hard time breathing, so Agnes looked, and there would be a black stocking, which would become a signature in this story, wrapped around Cindy's neck. It wasn't tight enough that it completely knocked her out, but it was tight enough that it was cutting off some of her breathing. And so Agnes would get this off of her, and Cindy would tell her what happened. So Cindy was very shaken while she told Agnes what happened. Apparently she had went out to her garage to get something, and all of a sudden somebody would come up from behind her. They would put the black nylon around her neck and they would start strangling her with it. And this would be tied to her neck. She would be knocked unconscious, and the only thing she remembers about her attacker is that they were wearing white tennis shoes. So they weren't anything specific, they were just white shoes, which really didn't help the police at all. But when Agnes had pulled up, Cindy believes that the attackers were actually scared away and they'd run off, and this is when Cindy had the opportunity to run off into the backyard and hide. And soon after, that's when Agnes would find her. Things only continued to go downhill from here after this incident. Cindy had even had incidents where raw meat was sent to her home. Really gross. And she would continue to get pictures of corpses and letters and phone calls, and things were just terrifying her to the point that she was afraid to leave her home. It would actually cause her many problems at work because she could not be there. So as I said before, police were not really believing Cindy's stories as she was telling them, and this angered her, and so she would end up hiring a private investigator by the name of Ozzie Caban, and he would start looking into what was happening to Cindy, and he actually really began to believe her story, and he thought that the police were wrong. Before she hires Caban, she would move to a new house. She would paint her car so that it was a different color, and she'd even change her last name so somebody would not be able to necessarily find her. But when Ozzie Caban began his work, he would actually give Cindy a walkie-talkie radio type thing so that he could hear if anything was going on the other end. But that didn't mean that Ozzie wasn't suspicious at all. And he would actually worry that Cindy was holding something back, that she wasn't necessarily doing it to herself, but she wasn't telling the whole truth. And he talked to her parents and her family, and they believed the same thing. And so Cindy would agree to actually take a polygraph test for Ozzie. And this is when they'd find out that Cindy was coming up as deceptive. Now, it was not deceptive that she was doing it to herself, but she was being deceptive when she'd say that she didn't know who was doing it to her. Many people believe, and this happens a lot with abuse and harassment cases, that she was very possibly just so afraid of her attacker that she did not want to tell anybody who it was. But she was showing up as deceptive, and this was super suspicious, but she was really scared. So as I said, Ozzie also had given Cindy a two-way radio so that she could get in contact with him if she needed help, and he also installed lights outside her home so you could see what was going on in the yard. Not long after is when the next major incident would happen to Cindy, and this one would leave her hospitalized. This incident is actually quite chilling. So her private investigator, Ozzy Caban, had been just doing something that night, and he heard strange noises coming from the walkie-talkie or the two-way radio. And he didn't want to just say something and try and get somebody to respond to him, because if there was somebody there, he did not want to scare them away. And so he would go straight over to Cindy's house. He would look in the window and he would actually see her laying there. This is when he would enter the home and he would actually see that a knife had been stabbed through Cindy James' hand. So between her hand and the knife, there was actually a note that Ozzy Caban would find, and it would say, "You are dead, bitch." Cindy was so motionless that Caban originally thought she was dead. So Cindy would be rushed to the hospital where she would regain consciousness, and this is where she would be able to tell investigators what had happened to her. Cindy said she had woken up from her sleep because she felt like she had felt somebody putting a needle into her arm. And then she would fall asleep and she would have no recollection of the stabbing of her hand. Now, the doctors did look at her and they actually did see a pin-sized hole in her arm. And so this only further made Ozzy Caban believe her. But the police still believed that Cindy had staged the attack, and so they would do no fingerprinting. They would really do no crime scene investigation at her home, including really looking into the note that much. And this would become something that could be very fatal for Cindy if it was an intruder that was doing this stuff to her. Her private investigator, Ozzy Caban, didn't believe that she would be able to inject herself with a needle and stab herself in the hand in the way that she had, but the police disagreed. So at this point, Cindy really wanted to prove what was happening to her, and she would agree to going under hypnosis and trying to take another polygraph test, but the results would come out that she was just too traumatized to be able to do this. And so police officers would start doing 24-hour surveillance scans on her home, and this is where nothing would happen. She'd get no phone calls those nights, no letters would show up, nothing strange would happen at Cindy's home, and police would once again just say, you know, you must be doing this to yourself for attention, and we're moving on. We can't keep spending time on this case. We've spent so many hours and so much money here, and nothing's happening. So either Cindy was doing it to herself, or the criminal was very smart in the way that knowing when the police are going to be there, and that if they don't do anything, they're just going to make Cindy look more crazy. So in the summer of 1984, the harassment would only intensify for Cindy, and she would not only be receiving calls at home, but she'd also be receiving them at work now, so it's like she couldn't really get away from it. Her fellow employees said that she was losing weight, she was very tired, she was paranoid all the time, so she was really starting to decline at this point. And then on June 18th, 1984, Cindy would actually trigger the alarm that Ozzy Caban had given her, because she had walked into her home and she had found a Rothman cigarette, which was not the kind of cigarettes that Cindy smoked, as well as a sexually explicit birthday card. But what was even more terrifying is she had found her dog in the corner in its own feces. It had a black nylon stocking around its neck, and it also looked like it had been beaten to the point where it was bruising, which is incredibly sad. And then not long after this, a fourth dead cat is found at Cindy's home. Over the course of these 7 years, Cindy would move multiple times because of these incidents, just trying to outrun who was doing this to her. And once again, the police were not believing her, so she just had to do what she had to do. So then on July 3rd, 1984, another major incident happens. So Cindy tells Caban that she is going to be taking her dog Heidi on a walk. This is something that she did very often, and 3 hours later, Cindy would knock on a neighbor's door and she would collapse, and a nylon stocking had been wrapped around her neck, which is something that we're hearing way too often now. She said that she had been stopped in the street by a man and a woman in a van, and that was the last thing that she really remembered, is them asking her for directions. And once again, there are needle marks in Cindy's arm, but they cannot find actual drugs within her system. So police would also start questioning Dr. Roy Makepeace, because there had been a point where Cindy said that she did believe that maybe he was the one doing it now. So she had changed her opinion from the beginning. She had actually undergone a hypnosis session, and she believes that she remembered when they would go boating. They were boating one time and they were out at, I don't know if it was an island or what it was. She actually remembers that she thinks that Dr. Roy Makepeace murdered someone, but when the case was actually looked into, they couldn't find any proof that this ever happened. And they also couldn't prove that Dr. Roy Makepeace was doing this stuff to Cindy. And so they couldn't bring him in, they couldn't arrest him. They had no proof of it. So the next attack is a very rapid escalation from the other ones. Even though the other ones were bad, this one was perhaps one of the worst, and this one would leave Cindy hospitalized and very injured. So Cindy was found nearly frozen 6 miles from her home with hypothermia. She was in a ditch, and she was left wearing a man's work glove and a boot. She also had the typical black nylon stocking around her neck, and she had been beat up. There was multiple bruises on Cindy, and she was just absolutely terrified after this incident. This is when she would ask her friend Agnes and her husband Tom Woodcock if she could stay with them for a little while, because she was just scared to be by herself. One night after everyone had gone to bed, Cindy would wake them up and she would say that she had heard noises in the basement and she was afraid. When they went to see what was going on, their basement was on fire. Tom would go to call 911, but their phone lines had been cut, and so Agnes would run across the street and she would have a neighbor call 911 to have the fire put out and to have the scene investigated. Tom said when they ran outside to call 911 that they had actually seen a man standing outside of the house. And this is why Agnes and Tom Woodcock would believe Cindy's story of the harassment, because they had seen someone at their house, but the person was running away as they came outside. So the police would determine that this incident was an act of arson. Somebody did start it deliberately, but again, they still believed that Cindy could have done it herself to gain attention and to further support her story. So with everything going on, Cindy's mental state was quickly deteriorating. As I had said before, she was losing weight. She wasn't really doing well in work. And so one of Cindy's doctors would actually commit her to a psychiatric hospital for a while. It is something that she needed and would also help her get away from the incidents that were happening to her. So after 10 weeks of care, Cindy would get out of the psychiatric hospital and she would actually tell her family that she had been withholding information, and that the reason she didn't want to tell anybody was that her attacker had threatened to kill her family and her if she would say who it was. And Cindy would not tell them anymore, but she just wanted them to know that. And that verified their suspicion that she knew who committed the crimes. Not long after, this is when Cindy would go to the police, like I said, and she would tell them that she believed that her ex-husband, Dr. Roy Makepeace, was behind the crimes. And they would question him for a long time, and he would tell them, hey, I don't have anything to do with this. You can look up my phone records. You can look up whatever you want. I don't have anything to do with it. And he did tell them that somebody had actually left a message at his home phone. So apparently whoever was harassing his ex-wife, Cindy James, had left a death threat on the answering machine for him. This message said, quote, "Cindy dead meat," end quote. That is all it said. It's a very chilling message, and it sounds like somebody is trying to disguise their voice. And this is why many people actually believe when you listen to it, they actually think this voice is Cindy trying to sound like a man. There is no proof of that, but that is what many people believe, that it's a woman trying to sound like a man. And I am going to play that for you. Dr. Roy Makepeace would then say that he believed that Cindy was suffering from split personality disorder. Now, just to mention, this is not something that at the psychiatric hospital that they had diagnosed her with. This is just something that he said that she possibly could be suffering from. So it seemed like the harassment was starting to cease again for Cindy. And in September of 1986, she would actually buy a home in Richmond. And then in October, even though the harassment had seemed to be fizzling out, she would change her name to James. And this is when she would become Cindy James. As I said before, her mental health had been declining, and so had her attendance at work and everything. And so in November of 1986, Cindy would actually be let go from her job at the Blenheim House, which is the preschool for children with disabilities that she loved to work at. And she had been working there since 1975. And so this was a super big blow to Cindy. She kind of started raveling into herself. But eventually she would find another job, and then in 1987, she would find a job working for Richmond General. So the next several months, things would start happening again to Cindy, and she'd report several different incidents, including a broken window, holes cut in her screen, and that her basement door was broken. It wouldn't be until October 26th, 1988, that the fifth major incident would happen to Cindy, the one before Cindy would be found dead. So at midnight, Cindy would trigger the alarm that Ozzy Caban had given her, as she had done multiple times before. This is when he would find her in her garage, partially nude. She had a black stocking tied around her neck. He had to cut it off. It was very tight. But this time, her hands and feet had been tied with another black stocking. And this was more of like a hog tie kind of tie. And so when everybody was saying that Cindy was staging these incidents for herself, it was hard for some to believe that she could tie herself this way. Cindy would say that what happened this time is that somebody had grabbed her while she was getting out of her car, and they attacked her, and then they left her there like that. More incidents would happen on and off for the next couple months, and I'm not going to get into them too much because as we have, this video is already getting very long. There is many incidents, and you can check out my links down below. I list all my sources. There is a timeline on there that you can look at that lists all of her phone calls to the police. But I think we're ready to talk about her final attack now. So in May of 1989, Cindy had actually taken off a couple days from Richmond General Hospital to just get some things done and have some time to herself. She wanted to do some grocery shopping and other things. And so she had gone to the mall to do some grocery shopping and to deposit a check. And this would be the last time that anybody would ever see Cindy alive. So like I said, on May 25th, 1989, the last day that Cindy was ever seen is when the police would find her car abandoned at the mall. There had been a small amount of blood on the vehicle, and Cindy was nowhere to be found. All of her groceries were in the car, and any personal belongings, which was very unusual. If you went to get your groceries, you're not going to leave them in your car to spoil. And this is when the police became a little concerned, as well as Ozzy Caban, her private investigator. So for 2 weeks, Cindy's family and friends would search for her. They wondered where she was at. They couldn't find her. They weren't sure if somebody had kidnapped her or if she had ran off. And so 2 weeks after she went missing, Cindy James would be found dead in the front yard of an abandoned home. It was very strange that nobody had found her sooner, because this was actually an area that had a lot of foot traffic from pedestrians, and so you would think somebody would find a body there. Because of this, some believe that she wasn't killed immediately after she had went missing, or somebody would have seen her, like I said. But after they did the autopsy, it was found out that she most likely had died the day that she went missing. Cindy's body showed numerous wounds on it. It looked like she may have been beaten. She was tied with a stocking like she had been so many times before around her neck, and her arms and legs were bound. And Cindy had actually had an ejection mark on her arm once more. But this time the toxicology report would show that this was a dose of morphine. The police would write this off as a suicide. Ozzy Caban did not believe that, neither did any of Cindy's friends or family. They thought that she had been kidnapped and murdered because they believed that she had been getting harassed for years. But the police would say that Cindy was perfectly capable of doing that all to herself. They would come to the conclusion that Cindy had injected herself, and the injection would have given her some time to get to the place that she was found, and then she would tie her legs and arms, and she would die there in that spot, committing suicide. This would be a very strange way to find somebody who had committed suicide, unless she had faked it all and she was trying to make people believe her story. But I don't understand how somebody could hog tie themselves. Apparently the police would contact an expert about ties, and they would say that it is possible to be able to do that, but the amount of time that she'd have to inject herself with morphine and then get all of that done at the same time is a very small amount of time. And so it's just something, I don't know if I can fall behind that theory or not. Her private investigator, Ozzy Caban, was not happy with the outcome of Cindy's case. He believes that somebody had drugged her, killed her, and then dumped her body there. This is what her parents believe as well. And the family was never satisfied with the conclusion that the police had come to in this case. Caban actually believed that the police weren't really interested in taking the time to find who was doing this to Cindy, and so it was just writing off the incident. So since Cindy's death in 1989, there have been multiple stories done on her, including a episode of Unsolved Mysteries where they actually talk with her parents, as well as, I believe it's the Not Expert or the Investigator and Ozzy Caban. I'll link that down below, so make sure to go check that out. And her sister Melanie Hack has actually written a book about Cindy's stories and the things that happened to her, as well as included pieces of her journals. And so I have linked her website down below as well, so make sure to go check that out. If you want to learn more about Cindy or her family, I would recommend getting her book. I think I am gonna try and check it out as well. So this story was actually one that I was gonna do like 2 weeks ago. I'm gonna be honest, I wasn't the happiest with the sources I got to use. You'll be able to look at them down below. They weren't the most scholarly sources like I am used to using. I try and use ones that are pretty verified or journalistic. But they do have a lot of information about her case, and it is very interesting. I hope I got a good amount of facts into this video. It seemed to have turned out very long, so I hope that you stayed with me the entire time. If you have not done so already, make sure to press that red subscribe button down below so you do not miss any of my future videos, as well as my funny crime videos, which I like to release as well. I have a lot of fun with them. Like I said before, I don't think they're doing too well here on YouTube, but I'm still going to make them because I have fun doing them. And those of you who do watch them, thank you. If you haven't done so already, make sure to check out my Instagram as well. This is where I post any updates on my videos or anything that has to do with true crime, as well as post true crime memes. Those links are also down below in the description box. And if you have any case suggestions, make sure to send them to killerconceptsvlog@gmail.com. I really hope you liked this strange case on Cindy James. And if you have any questions, comments, or anything that I may have missed that you'd like to add, as long as you do it respectfully, go ahead and comment that down below. Or you can send me an email. I want you to remember that the world's most dangerous minds hide in the most unlikely places, and to stay safe. Have a good week.